Morning, everyone. As Andrew said, my name's Aaron Peate, and I'm a director in the planning consultancy team in WSP. Apologies in advance for my cold. So I did an update on the planning system changes when we last presented in March at our healthcare webinar, and I think at that point Boris had not long announced that he was undertaking the most radical review of the planning system since the Second World War, or so he believed. Well, 6 months is a long time in planning. We now have a very new Housing Secretary of State in Michael Gove. Let's see how that goes. There's been a Tory backlash to the proposed strategic changes to the planning system set out in the white paper of last year, which, if you read and believe the papers, will lead to a dilution in the resulting changes. I think Michael Gove last week, or this week actually, announced that he'll pause and review the emerging planning bill before deciding how to progress. So whilst I'd hope to be able to report in a bit more detail on the planning bill in this presentation, unfortunately we probably won't hear a lot more until later into the autumn. So I mean, what has been clear is that many areas of planning has changed over the last year through secondary legislation, which I believe sort of Dominic Cummings took credit for recently, all with the aim of hopefully streamlining the planning process and providing more opportunities for those looking to bring forward development, which includes the healthcare sector. So, I mean, in this presentation, I'll quickly canter through the implemented and future changes in the planning system, focus on those aspects that I think are relevant to the healthcare sector, but also pause where I think particular attention should be paid to get the most out of the system when planning for the NHS estate and other healthcare facilities. So most people will know WSP, but we in the planning consultancy team were Indigo Planning up to about a year and a half ago when we joined up with WSP. And we still do what we've always done over the last 30 years, and that's give our clients personalised and proactive planning advice, but we now do that as one of the largest multidisciplinary consultancies in the UK. Next slide, please, Andrew. So, I mean, I work across many sectors, but one of my specialisms is working within the healthcare sector, and this involves working on estate planning, early pre-application engagement and local plan promotion on behalf of NHS trusts, through to preparing detailed planning applications for new healthcare facilities and hospitals, or negotiating enabling residential schemes on surplus NHS land. So the full gambit of planning services. Next slide, please. So back in the spring of last year, there was a host of provisions were put in place by government to respond to the pandemic. First, it was to put in place provisions for local authorities to operate virtually during the pandemic, and this involved most councils having virtual planning committees, virtual pre-application meetings, virtual consultation events, and I think they've worked well in the main, and all things considered. And whilst the ability to hold virtual committees ended in May, to some councillors' displeasure, I think other virtual events and meetings are here to stay. I mean, certainly I've not done a pre-app meeting in person for a considerable period of time, and at WSP we've been running consultations through websites and virtual exhibition board tours successfully for some time. So anything that will save local authorities time and money, I'm sure, is here to stay. And I think one thing I've absolutely noticed over the last 18 months is a continued decline in the resourcing and performance of local authorities, which I'll come back to in a bit. Next slide, please. So I think last time I presented on this, I mentioned two measures, or proposed measures at that time, that would help expedite the delivery of the planned public service infrastructure, and both measures have since come into force. The first, in July this year, the government amended the existing permitted development right to allow hospitals greater expansion of their buildings to allow without the need for planning permission. So under this new right, hospitals can now expand by up to 25% of the footprint of the current buildings on site as of the 21st of April 2021, or up to 250 square metres, whichever is greater. There is a proposed height limit of 6 metres, but that's been extended up from 5. And the only exception is that buildings cannot be within 10 metres of the boundary to protect neighbour residents. So this is in force, as I mentioned, and I think obviously this in this particular circumstance would avoid the need for planning for any sort of small to medium-sized extension to hospitals, which has to be a good thing, and will hopefully deliver those small to medium-sized projects quicker without having to go through the planning process. Next slide, please. The second measure that I mentioned last time round was the reduction in the statutory determination period for hospital projects from 13 weeks to 10. So this applies to large hospital projects of over 1,000 square metres in size, which aren't EIA development. And within this 10-week period, public consultations reduced from 21 days to 18. It was originally going to go down to 14, so it's only a small reduction in public consultation, but it's all beneficial to help streamline that process. There's also an expectation that local authorities prioritise post-submission matters like Section 106 agreements, etc., which we know can take a long time to finalise following resolution. And again, this came into force on the 1st of August. So again, good news. It's got to be good news, and at least there's a stick to beat local authorities with in terms of delivery. I mean, it'll certainly focus efforts into the pre-application stage. So that we'll be ironing out issues as soon as possible before the application is submitted. And I think the main point remains, as I mentioned earlier on, is whether already stretched local authorities will be able to deliver on this promise without government priorities like housing suffering. So we'll see. Yeah, the slide that we're on. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So I think it's just worth reiterating one of the key changes to the planning use class order that came into force in September last year. So to address, I think in the main, the decline of the high street and the impact of internet shopping, even before the pandemic, actually, a new umbrella use class E covering commercial, business and service uses has been introduced. So this use class E now subsumes classes A1, which were shops, A2 professional services, A3 restaurants, B1 offices, and parts of D1, including clinics and health centres. So clinics and health centres, which were previously D1, are now class E. And the important point here is that any property within class E can now move between the use as a shop, a health centre, a restaurant, gym, office, light industrial unit, for example, without the need for planning permission. And I think this does present opportunities for the health sector. I mean, firstly, it opens up town centres to a whole range of additional uses, including healthcare, where otherwise it may have been protected for retail uses. Upper floors of offices can now be used for health and medical facilities without the need for planning permission, and vice versa. Out of centre light industrial premises, previously protected for employment purposes, can now be used for other uses, including medical and healthcare. The MPPG encourages the multi-use of spaces and buildings, with different uses during a single day. What might be a health centre during the day could be a leisure centre at night, or leisure use at night, and permission wouldn't be needed to do that. I mean, clearly, the planning system hasn't been the only barrier to this in the past, and some of these dual uses might not work, but at least it opens up the market to provide more innovative models for land uses and the movement between them. I'll be interested to see what this does for property values and rents, as a site that could only be used for one use previously and can now be put to a host of different and potentially higher value uses without the need for planning. Will there be more pressure on landlords to push up rents or push out lower value uses? Again, we'll see, and it's probably a little bit early to tell. I think it's also worth just noting that local authorities, aren't particularly happy with this change, as it's given them less control over high streets and limited their ability to control existing use. We've certainly seen local authorities looking to restrict new planning permissions for development to limit that movement within Class E, and this needs to be carefully managed if flexibility is indeed, the desired outcome. So next slide, Andrew, please. So yes, absolutely. Since I last presented, and only a month or so ago, there's been a further permitted development right change, which allows the conversion of buildings in Class E, which I mentioned, could be a whole host of uses now, to residential use. And this was introduced on the 1st of August. So For healthcare, this could involve converting a health centre of a certain size to residential, and that would now be acceptable in principle. Um, you know, this might be a useful avenue for surplus healthcare assets where normally justification would be needed for the loss of a community facility, which is certainly the biggest issue we face when trying to work with surplus NHS assets. Prior approval of the council is still needed for a number of considerations like flooding, transport contamination, for example. But I think the point is the key issue of principle has already been established and accepted by the local authority. Section 106 contributions aren't required under this PDR, which, in one respect is great, but also means, less potential to justify health infrastructure funds if significant levels of housing is provided in this ad hoc way. So, a few conditions, as always with these things. There's size thresholds of 1,500 square meters. The building has got to be within, have been in commercial business and service use for the last 2 years. I say for 2 years, and only applies to building that have been vacant for at least 3 continuous months. But it might be a useful avenue for estate planners to look at. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that the planning white paper's proposed changes to the planning system has been delayed and likely to be watered down. And I think one area where it will be watered down is the proposed move to a more zonal planning system, in local plans. So, it was proposed that all areas would have either growth areas or growth zones, renewal areas and protected areas. So every area would have one of the 3 designations, and some of that decision making would be taken away from a local authority. So we think that's likely to be watered down. But I think one area that will change is the preparation of local plans and the ability to prepare them at speed, whatever that means. So this will certainly have to mean, shorter, standardized, more visual and digitized plans. I think the proposed plan reforms will mean local authorities will revise their plans sometime soon. So every local authority will have to go through that process in the coming years, and the aim is that these will be reviewed within 30 months, which would be a huge increase on what is effectively a 7-year process to date. There's likely to be more design codes set locally, and the main development control policies are likely to be set at a national level. So a real sort of shift potentially in the local plan position. I mentioned this last time, but our advice in the for the NHS and any healthcare providers really is the need to engage in the process at the earliest possible opportunity at both a political and officer level to ensure that current and future interests are properly reflected. Given what I've said earlier about the sort of changing importance of different levels of government in policy setting, it may be more necessary to engage at all levels. At a national level, at a local authority level, potentially with design codes and neighbourhood plans at a local level, because they all have an impact on the ability for you to bring forward your development proposals. What is clear is, it is very difficult once policy's been set to bring forward proposals that are not in line with the plan or justify exceptions to policy, such as the loss of healthcare facilities, even if the LPA is supportive in principle. We would say that even at an early stage in estate planning processes, you should be getting buy-in from key principles of the development and building relationships with key officers and councillors. You really should be proactive rather than reactive in this regard. We do a lot of work for NHSPS, who are well versed in the need for local plan promotion. We've represented their interests recently in the formulation of the adopted London plan to try and shape healthcare policies and policies that might impact on their ability to redevelop their sites on land, such as, in relation to the requirements for affordable housing on public land. So next slide, please. I've got a great deal to say here, but it is worth pausing for a minute. I mentioned before actually that there are likely to be major reforms afoot for Section 106 and SIL. Well, we don't know what those major reforms are yet, and the messaging is becoming even more mixed. I think in July, the previous Secretary of State said the government would replace the current system with a much more predictable, transparent levies that would be set locally locally levied with greater flexibility for councils to determine how they spend that money. Uh, that is in contrast to actually what the white paper said. And they were talking about a single nationally set value-based flat rate charge to replace the current system of obligations. So watch this space, but it's clear that that whole system will be changing over the next year or so. There was also a consultation, I think, alongside the white paper that talked about increasing the threshold of affordable housing from 10 units to 40 or 50. Therefore, smaller sites would not have to deliver affordable, which, you know, again, may be useful for surplus NHS assets when you're looking to get rid of. All these changes are a little way off, but again, you know, healthcare provision can secure the allocation of SIL and Section 106 funds now. You know, similar to local plan promotion, they require active and early engagement with councils to make the case for investment and release of appropriate funds. I mean, healthcare projects need to be at the top of this priority list, and with the allocation of funding a matter for the charging authority alone, it's imperative that you're ready to make a robust case early to the local authority. I mean, after our last webinar, it was great that I was contacted by a number of trusts who were making good headway in claiming these SIL and Section 106 funds locally. SIL charges and items on the SIL list need to be justified by evidence, you know, which could include the identification of specific healthcare infrastructure needs resulting from planned development, such as GP surgeries and hospitals. And that list could include contributions to wider infrastructure that could include health or reduce health inequalities, such as green infrastructure or cycle paths, including providing a local need, can be demonstrated. Next slide, please. So, I mean, there's a number of other areas of planning that are likely to change as well, which I thought I'd just quickly touch on. One is the much talked about environmental bill, which will hopefully get royal assent soon, after 2 years in the making. One of the key aspects of the environmental bill will be the introduction of a legal requirement for developments to deliver a 10% gain in biodiversity. So, an admirable measure, but one that obviously development will need to take account of from the outset. I mean, we're finding in practice anyway, actually, a number of local London authorities, and other forward-thinking councils are already looking for betterment in biodiversity terms. So, you know, this has been talked about for a while, but some local authorities are already seeking new development and betterment for biodiversity. I think it's quite interesting to see how, you know, the protectionist environmental bill dovetails with the pro-development emerging planning bill, you know, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why both sets of legislation have been delayed. There's also been a number of changes to the NPPF, some relating to climate change and net zero, which we'll hear a little bit more about in the next presentation, and how it relates to the NHS estate. Important changes in fire safety are making their way into the planning process post Grenfell. There's a now requirement for a fire statement for buildings taller than 18 metres or 7 stories to be submitted at the planning application stage. And again, you know, typically with London, it often sort of moves ahead of others. We've had fire safety matters coming into the planning application stage for some time. So many applications that we deal with, big and small, and now need to consider fire safety now, as opposed to revisiting and revising consented schemes later in the development process due to the impact on fire safety. The beauty objective and design codes are likely to become commonplace in months to come, with the responsibility falling to the developer and landlord to prepare. Levelling up, whatever that means, you know, there is a white paper that's due, again around this sort of time, which the government says will focus on challenges including improving living conditions, growing the private sector, and increasing and spreading opportunity. So we'll see what that means for the planning sector, but I suspect, you know, it might involve development corporations to aid regeneration in particular areas that are needed. And finally, the whole resourcing and LPA, you know, sort of delivery and performance is well known, but the government have talked about addressing that. Well, they talked about it last year. We've not seen anything, and there's no proposals published to date. Maybe a resourcing issue in itself. But the government were talking about it still in July, and said that they were exploring a strategy and the options to introduce a new planning fee structure to support changes proposed. So clearly the expectation is that the applicant will pay for the resource shortages in local authorities, and certainly my experience suggests if you are going to get a better process, many applicants are willing to do that. But again, we'll see what happens, but I think we all agree that it needs to be done quickly. And my last slide, please. So just a few key takeaways. Lots of changes happening at the moment, more envisaged, all I think with the intent of requiring a lighter touch and less time spent in the planning process, which even I'll agree is a good thing. Hopefully more will be known during the course of autumn with regard to the strategic matters raised in the planning white paper. But in any event, you know, our firm advice is to engage early in the changing planning process, ever-changing planning process, whether it be the formulation of planning policy, local plan allocations, or seal charging schedules. You know, once adopted, as I've mentioned, it's very difficult to progress plans that are not anticipated in policy. I think it's really worth saying that, you know, don't forget that the provision of healthcare facilities is a good news story. So their need and benefits, the benefits that arise locally, should always be emphasised. I mean, we're finding on loads of projects at the moment that some authorities are being very encouraging, almost seem desperate for investment in otherwise previously restricted countryside locations. So, you know, now is the time to maybe move forward some of these schemes have been put on hold. And I think clearly the government recognised the need to get the process working quicker for healthcare projects, which is great. And I think that, you know, the worry is that maybe the continued resourcing in local authorities will potentially undermine this, but at least it gives us something to work with. So thank you very much.